My name is Hannah Cheek and I work for Pearson, overseeing science assessments. I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Brown today to talk about how science teachers can effectively embed better diversity and inclusion within their science education. Dr. Brown is a professor of teacher education at Stanford University and author of the book, Science in the City, Culturally Relevant STEM Education. His research explores the relationship between student identity, classroom culture, and academic achievement in science education. He focuses on the social connotations and cultural politics of science in the classroom, as well as how teacher and student interactions serve to shape learning opportunities. Dr. Brown's work in science education in urban communities focuses on developing collaborative curricular cycles and classroom pedagogy, and Dr. Brown's recent work explores how race, language, and culture impact on students' learning in urban science classrooms. So firstly, welcome, Dr. Brown, and thank you so much for giving your time to talk to us today. You're clearly leading the way with your research around inclusivity in science, and I'm going to start with quite a simple question, which is, why is that so important?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I guess the first issue about why it's important is rooted in the culture of science. If you think of English as a discipline, if a person is a poor writer, we don't say, you're just not a good writer because you're not smart enough to be a good writer. Right? We have a culture of intellectual elitism in science that is pervasive. And part of what that does is it allows us to hide behind poor instruction. And so that may seem a little bit tangential to the question, but if you add layers of culture to it, if I am aware that people like me are not a part of this field that is for the intellectually elite, then any cues that I get that might suggest that I'm not a member of this community can tell me that I'm barking up the wrong tree. I'm headed the wrong direction. And so what we want to do is make sure that if we're going to create a culture of excellent scientists across the world, that it is inclusive of people from multiple perspectives. And one way to do that is to make sure that the science we are teaching sends an alternative message. And so instead of sending the message that you don't belong, it needs to be obvious that science is a part of every culture.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, you know, those cues are coming from outside of the classroom, but I suppose it's about recognizing when they are also inside of the classroom and which of those we can control. We recently held a roundtable to start the conversation with science educators about diversity and inclusion in science. And what science teachers are telling us time and again is that they would really like some practical tips about how they could do that and how they could better embed diversity and inclusion in their classrooms. What would you say to those teachers?
It's a great question. And one of the things that we struggle with is being practical and how this might happen. So I'll start with a few. And in our teacher education program, the way that we explain the first steps in teaching is to say that the curriculum is never the science, it's always the people in the room. That being said, we don't teach science, we teach people. And what we want them to learn is science. So I have to relearn the science in the context of the culture of the kids so that I can help them understand it. And so this may seem abstract, but it is it is a cognitive. I use an example regularly that we forgot phone numbers, that there was a time when we remembered everyone's phone numbers and addresses, right? And the reason why we don't have them is the minute we had a smartphone, right? The minute we could look it up is we delete all unnecessary information. So you might ask, well, how is this associated with science? If that principle is fundamental to our cognitive functioning, then we won't remember any of the science that we are learning unless it is functional and useful. So that goes back to this issue of cultural diversity. So if I'm teaching you the science of your local context, you're more likely to remember it and apply it. So practically, what might that look like? And so instead of walking in the room and deciding today we're going to learn about osmosis and how water moves across membranes, I might start with a lesson about how marinating food does something to the food, right? If we believe that marinating a local cultural dish is going to make the meat more flavorful, two things happen. One, you draw a connection between the science that I'm teaching and the culture that I'm a part of. Two, you make it easier for me to remember because I see it on a regular basis. And so one of the things you have to do to start is change the curriculum by teaching science in context. And that's the hardest part, because as a teacher, if I never learned about hydrogen bonding as an explanation for why hair texture will change based on the weather, then I've got to relearn it. I have to engage in really the work of pedagogical content knowledge. That's one thing. The second is a shift in how we approach both formative and summative assessment. And so we really pushed very hard. Is asking students to explain is an initial access. That's knowledge. But asking them to explain the science concept, how it matters to their local context, why it's important for us to know, that's understanding. That's a deeper knowledge that comes from Wiggins and McTighe. So we take the same thing, osmosis. Well, how is osmosis important to food? How do we use it for our body and our local health? And how does osmosis and having access to clean water help engage in the community beyond? So we want to then, for our formative assessments, have students explain how osmosis works, but also explain these local implications, right? So the second thing we want you to do as a teacher is to start with topics that speak to the students, but along the way in your lesson, making sure that they have lots of opportunities to talk about it. Third thing, changing your audience for your formative assessment, right? And this is big. So why are they explaining to you what they've learned, right? That's inauthentic. You're just the teacher, and they explain to you often. So why not take it to the government, right? We're going to explain why we need clean water. We're going to create videos. We'll send those out so we can explain this local social issue. And so part of what we really want teachers to do is make pragmatic changes in the lesson, but then magnify the scale of the science that they're teaching so students are empowered to see why science is important. So changing the audience is one, relearning and reteaching in the context of the students' lives is a second. And the third thing is a pretty profound shift in how you approach your formative and summative assessments. So they're talking about science in the pursuit of other things.
Brilliant, thank you. That's so useful. And I'm thinking about in the UK that we've got a new framework that schools are inspected by, the inspection framework, and part of that is about using local context in lessons. And I can really see why that is so important in terms of promoting diversity and inclusion. That's really interesting. And also, you know, I was a biology teacher for 15 years and role models was something that I thought was really important. And there's a few different ways that you can approach that. You can look at contemporary role models and look at the discoveries that they're making at the moment. I always thought it was quite nice to link up with, you know, people working in science industry and allow students to see those, to try and see a more diverse selection of role models. But there's also, of course, the historical role models that have made huge contributions to the advancement of science. But what I think is really important not to shy away from, and I think sort of aligning to the conversation that's happening a lot with Black Lives Matters at the moment, is not to sort of hide away from sometimes the history and the context of that is quite unpleasant. I'm thinking about links that were made between eugenics and genetics. But as science teachers, we're not, you know, social scientists, and sometimes it can be quite daunting to enter into those conversations in a classroom environment. Have you got anything that you would suggest for STEM teachers to be able to support them with those conversations?
Certainly. I think the question of how science speaks to these broader local and national and international issues of societal function are hugely important. And what we have to remember is these are the things that are driving the kids every day. They are intrigued by it. They want to know what's going on. And so part of what we have to think is that science for us is a way to give the kids a liberatory power to say to themselves, science can help explain these things well beyond us. And science is a tool for me to change the society that I'm in. So now here's the caution, and the caveat for every science teacher is that I don't need you to be a social scientist. I need you to teach the science well enough so kids can go out and take perspective. This is not to say they have to solve a problem, but they can take perspective. So for example, in the US, we have a huge issue with diabetes, right? So if we're thinking about who has access to the food that would help people not have diabetes, fresh fruits and vegetables, kind of getting away from really carbohydrate dense diets, well, there are so many basic science lessons about the role of macromolecules, about the digestive system, that if we teach those issues and have the students take perspective, and that perspective is, given what we know, how does this explain this concept? So what I need teachers to understand is you don't really need them to have the solution to the social issue, but be empowered to know the science well enough, right? And if you think about this international crisis with COVID, this is an embedded lesson on the role of antibodies, on antigens. I mean, biology teachers have to ask themselves, well, how do we want these kids to go out into the world? So for example, we have an anti-vaccine community and kind of a movement in the US right now. So the students who learn about antibodies, we want them to take perspective, not to go out and solve the problem, but to be able to explain thoroughly, here's how antibodies work. And if you change your audience and your lesson plans, and the outcome is we're going to create, let's say, for example, instructional videos about how viruses work, but we're going to take a perspective and say, for those of you who think that we shouldn't have antibodies, here's what the science is. For those of you who think that we should, here's what the science is. So you use the science as the middle ground so the students can talk about the things that they want to.
Yeah, so using the science to kind of encourage the debate rather than speaking to the debate yourself. Yeah, that sounds really, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that I found really interesting in your book, Science in the City, was the impact of language on student outcomes. And as you describe it, the dialect-centred dilemma. So for the benefit of those listening, can you just explain a bit about what that is and how that has an impact on students?
So I tease, I'm talking to a group of science teachers in the UK, and there's a reason why we don't have British accents in the US. And that reason is someone decided, I want to start my own identity. I want to sound like something else. And we do, however, have regional accents. And so people can move across the world. So the question is, why do we have accents that help us identify with a particular culture? And the simple solution is we like sounding like a particular community of people. And so if that is the case, language sends two messages. One is content, and the second is who I am. So as a professor, I have to make a choice. Here's how I will communicate. It is a conscious decision. So what does that mean for students? Is that I'm in the classroom and I hear things like, well, inside of the nucleus is the nucleolus, and the nucleolus is responsible for ribosome production, and ribosomes make protein, right? You've done something to me. You told me, one, I don't understand because there's too many science terms in there. And two, I'm now participating in a culture that I don't feel comfortable with. And so if language cues and sends a message about who we are, and it sends messages of content, then I have to be careful as a teacher to make sure I'm not telling students that you don't belong to this culture. And there was a study by Alverman that said in an introductory level biology class, you often have more new terms than you'd have in an introductory level Spanish class, right? So if you have this huge volume of terms, and we don't take any care for how it might position people as insiders or outsiders, then we run the risk of sending an additional message that science is for everybody but you. That's one layer. Mm-hmm. The second is that if I'm a student and I learn about science principles, let's say friction, but I learn about it from riding a skateboard every day, I'm not going to learn the academic terms because the culture of riding a skateboard does not require me to understand the scientific terms to describe friction. I might have alternative terminologies. So as a teacher, my students might have a really rich understanding of a concept, but it's not communicated in the science language. And so this is what we call the language identity dilemma. Because on one end, you send a message to kids that they don't belong. On the second, you don't understand the ideas that the kids are communicating. And so teachers have to be very attuned to how they use language. And then when kids are speaking, you have to ask a very simple question. What do you mean by, right? And then that way you get to the true understanding of what kids are thinking.
So would you suggest that the sort of simple response to that, I suppose, is just to invest time in in decoding the language that the students are using to explain their concepts?
Yeah, so we spent about 10 years studying this experimentally, right? So the idea for us was if the idea and the language are not the same thing, what came first? Right? So chicken or the egg? When the answer to the chicken and the egg question is this wasn't a chicken egg, right? There was something before. So similarly, the idea came and then scientists labeled the idea, but they had to talk about it before they created the label. So why are we so concerned about the label if the label hinders understanding? So what we do is we develop this approach called disaggregate instruction, which is to say, start your instruction by introducing the idea, but remove the language so that you can promote a deeper understanding of the concept. So I might talk about, water moving across the tiny holes in the cell, and the size of the holes matters. But I might not say semi-permeable membrane initially. I want to just get the idea first. The second part of the instruction is to be really, really explicit about the language. So now that we understand what we're talking about, let's now use the word semi-permeable membrane. So we're going to explicitly teach the language, because the issue is not only is there discomfort, but we need to take care to teach the language. And here's what I mean by teach the language: just allowing the students to practice. And so I might ask them to explain, why do you spray the vegetables at the grocery store? But I'm also going to embed a language practice. I'll say, in your explanation, use words like semi-permeable membrane, isotonic solution, hypertonic solution, equilibrium, so they get practice explaining the language itself. We are really emphasizing, let's try to remove the anxiety of language learning by starting with simple language and give students lots of practice so they can become masters of the new language.
Brilliant, thank you. That brings me nicely on to something else that struck me in the book, which was that you were describing the best way of gaining quite a deep understanding of science concepts is by actually teaching it to somebody else. And as a biologist that has been tasked with teaching physics from time to time, I can really, empathise with that point of view. And it's true that, often the person who's making that gain in a classroom is the teacher, because they are spending a lot of time explaining to the students. And you describe something called the generativity principle, which my understanding is giving students that opportunity to teach each other. I'd really appreciate it if you could give us a bit more information about that and the impact that has on supporting inclusivity.
So I think that's a really intriguing disciplinary hole in instruction is when you go to a chemistry class, the one thing you are not expected to know is chemistry. You come to the class because you don't know it. And then the teacher asks you a bunch of questions about chemistry, the one thing that you should not know. And so this game of guess what's inside my head, it doesn't benefit anyone. And if you ask someone how they learn, particularly how you learn a foreign language, they would say, well, you go to another country and getting it wrong, being forced to use the language produces mastery. So if that is the case, then our classroom discussions, the way that we assess should be dramatically different. Students should be asked to explain, and we should expect them not to have the answer. But in the process of explaining is how you go from I don't know it to now I've mastered the concept. So classrooms should be loud places, busy places where everybody is engaged in an explanation. And teachers know that because every teacher I know will tell you, well, I really mastered the context because I had to teach it. So why are we so invested in making sure the students understand the information first? Why do we give them the information first as opposed to allowing the process of explaining to be the master teacher? And so we call this the generativity principle, this idea of allowing our formative assessments to empower the kids to generate understanding. So a classroom should be rich and deep in formative assessments where kids are always explaining. More importantly, we have to reduce the anxiety. We have to build a culture where the kids know the reason why I'm having you explain these ideas is because if you have to explain it several times, that's how you'll arrive at mastery.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And just moving on to assessment, both formative and summative, there's obviously, as you described already, sometimes a gap between what the student knows in terms of how a principle works or the principles of how something works, say photosynthesis, but maybe their language doesn't match the level of understanding. What strategies would you recommend in terms of assessment so that students can demonstrate their true understanding of science principles?
Sure. So I'm a huge fan of both performance-based assessments and project-based assessments that require explanation and advanced expertise. With the multiple choice test, you really are asking students the verb that's happening is, can you recognize the correct idea? I'm more focused on production. Can you produce clarity in an explanation? And the ways that you do that are to give students tasks that require them to argue why one answer is right while the alternative cannot be true, to explain how a concept applies to another idea. So lots of opportunities for students to demonstrate what they know in meaningful context. And the meaningful context is what drives sustained learning. Now, if you have another layer, the other layer is inclusivity. So it's hard to tell a student that you're not a scientist when you're engaged in arguments for scientific reform. Let's say you're learning about meiosis, and the lesson is a lesson where we're going to write to our government about how the biological ideal of race is a fallacy, and that social structures are changing the society, but biologically, we're more similar than we are different. And that needs to be a part of how we think about the world. It's very difficult to now convince me as a young person that I'm not a part of a scientific community because I've already been engaged. And so one of the things teachers can do is really being creative about changing your audience and using assessment both to give them lots of opportunities to explain, because that's when mastery happens, but enables them to participate in science in a way that is authentic, because that tells them I'm a part of this community.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to wrap up here, but before I go, Dr. Brown, I'm going to give you the final word. So if there were 3 things that you would task all science teachers to do to promote more diversity and inclusion in their classrooms, what would they be?
So the first is the most pragmatic, and it's lesson planning that talks about localized issues that are culturally relevant. Let the science be a solution and a voice in your local community, which requires you to think differently about the chemistry you're teaching, the physics you're teaching. Let's learn about where it happens in the lives of the kids. Now, I want to be very explicit here, not the lives of the teachers, the lives of the kids. And so we have to do the work of learning where our content matters through lesson planning. And this is important because this will change the entire school. Because if you build a curriculum base, now you have teams of teachers helping kids in the school see how science is important to their community. The second is representation. So I like to make this argument that if you're parallel parking, sometimes if you're like me at all, I might turn the music down to give me a little bit more time to focus, right? You don't need to, it just makes it easier, right? So similarly, why do we allow our kids to ask themselves, should I be a part of the science community? Are women like me? Are Muslims like me? Are African Americans like me? Are Latinx people like me a part of the scientific community? Well, focus on representation. And here's what I mean. We have this new digital world. You can connect to graduate students, to science presentations. There are people of every component of the world engaged in science. You can find it on YouTube. You can Skype people in. Focus on representation so you can reduce a little bit of that psychological noise that students are experiencing. And then finally, give them authentic experiences. Take the science out of the classroom. So if they're learning about a scientific idea, let's go do something with that idea, because nothing sends a message that I belong by you louder than actually being a part of a particular community.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, for your time so much, Dr. Brown. It was such a fascinating conversation, and you've given us some brilliant practical tips that the science teaching community can go away with. So thank you for that. And I'm sure it will have an enormous impact on students going forwards. For teachers listening, if you want to learn more about the things that Dr. Brown was talking about, I highly recommend his book, Science in the City, Culturally Relevant STEM Education. And if you'd like to know a bit more about what Pearson are doing to support diversity in science, then please visit our website using the link below.